The 1960s were a time of revolutions and social change, with movements such as the civil rights movement, gay rights movement, and anti-war movement, among others. Women were involved in these movements just as much as men were. However, they were still limited in what they could do for the movement and were prevented from participating and being heard by the men who were involved. Even though these social and political movements were about equal rights, the men involved in these movements still did not see women as valuable in the progressive movements. Essentially, women were told to take a back seat. However, women were able to find freedom and self-expression through second wave feminism, which eventually translated over into the women's music movement. The female artists involved in the women's music movement used their unique experiences as not only women in patriarchal society, but also as closeted lesbians who could not express their sexuality. By studying the lyrics and backgrounds of Meg Christian and Chris Williamson, two of the top names to come out of the women's music movement, as well as the history and context of how this movement came to be, I will argue that the roots of the women's music movement differed from the male-dominated rock and roll of the 1960s, and that affected the topics in which the artists wrote about. Rock and roll in the 1960s was generally considered a man's genre, and very few women were able to break into it. According to the book Girls Rock, women, especially lesbian women, have cast a faint shadow on rock and roll. Even a popular all-female band like Fanny only achieved mention in Rolling Stone. All-female bands and female-fronted rock bands are often erased from rock history, unlike the male bands that could become rock stars with seemingly overnight success. Also, like many aspects of society, men dominated the music industry in the performance side as well as the business side, which made it harder for female music producers and sound engineers to break into the industry. During the 1960s, rock and roll was highly associated with anti-war topics and typically did not branch out into topics that women in particular could relate to. Overall, the male-dominated rock industry catered to men in many ways other than performance. Men dominated the business side of the genre as well as the topics that they wrote about. Before the social movements of the 1960s, social norms and mores dictated that women belonged in the domestic sphere. Women were limited in what they could do economically, socially, sexually, and politically. Virtually every aspect of society had women put into a small box that dictated what a woman could and could not do. Homosexuals were especially shunned from the Bible-run, pre-New Love movement American society. To break away from the sexual and social conformity, people sought freedom in bars and other public spaces in society, such as bookshops, coffee shops, and restaurants where they could speak freely about their desires. However, they still risked being overheard by others. At this point in time, women did not have opportunities to express themselves freely and feared the retaliation of men, as well as their community, if someone found out that they did not conform to the social norms. By seeing the sexism in the civil rights movement and anti-war movement, women began to rise and fight against the gender divide. Thus began second-wave feminism. And from second-wave feminism came the women's music movement and the rise of the all-female founded Olivia Records company. In a Netflix documentary titled Feminists, What Were They Thinking?, women of the second-wave feminist movement discuss their motivations for starting the movement while reminiscing on the portraits created by photographer Cynthia McAdams, who wanted to portray the second-wave feminists. Feminists of younger generations look at these photographs and talk about how they, second-wave feminists, look so free because they are expressing who they are and their inner desires. Second-wave feminism freed women physically from the confines of the home. However, women were also freed mentally, for now they could speak their minds freely. Many women were even able to express their sexuality in a freer society. Female artists like Meg Christian and Chris Williamson and Holly Near were able to express their feelings and sexuality in their music. Thus, their involvement and association with the women's music movement began. The women's music movement began during second-wave feminism and was a response to male-led rock and roll era of the 1960s, as well as the exclusion of women from civil rights and anti-war movements. These women saw the patriarchal divide that existed in these movements that called for equal rights. Musically, the women's music movement followed and found inspiration in the folk music movement of the 1960s. They continued to use these musical characteristics in their own music. However, this movement was not about creating a different genre. It was about writing lyrics and using topics that had never been used before. Women at women's music events wanted to be spoken to by the musicians while also being surrounded by women that relate to her. This movement was meant to tell the stories of women and lesbians, stories that have been ignored and covered up by America's patriarchal society. These women were looking for freedom, and they were able to find it in music. Thus, Olivia Records was founded in 1973 in Washington, D.C., in order to give female artists a non-oppressive working environment. Olivia was founded by 10 lesbian feminists, including Meg Christian, Judy DeLugich, and Jenny Burson, who were each interested in the fusion of politics, performance, and production in finding an economically workable means of serving the radical women's community. They surrounded themselves with women inside and outside the recording studio, including sound engineers and producers. It felt like a safe space for their creativity without the judgment and criticism of men who often look down on women in the rock and roll industry. This environment was more comfortable for the performers. They used the term women's music because at the time it was too risky to use the term lesbian. The Olivia founders thought of themselves as a political entity, especially when it came to the album Lesbian Concentrate, which was the first for a lot of those to come out and say that they were lesbian. This was their chance as women and as lesbians to tell their stories and to show society who they are. This was their way of fighting social norms and mores. One of the women who forefronted the founding of Olivia Records and sought to combine the music with feminism as a musician was Meg Christian. As a women's separatist and lesbian separatist, Meg Christian very much sided with second-wave feminism and thought that women could thrive if they were in a non-patriarchal world. Meg Christian, a creator of contemporary women's culture and the biggest artist to come out of Olivia Records, was also one of the major players in the women's music movement. As a musician, Christian took great interest in folk music and Appalachian guitar styles and incorporated these musical characteristics into her own music. The songs on her first album followed the theme of coming out as a lesbian in the women's community during the 1960s. Her intent with her music was to show women that they could express themselves in an honest way while also going through the process of self-discovery. In an interview with Mary Pollock, Christian stated that she saw that popular music did not tell her story, and that Christian wanted to write music that did tell her story. She thought as a feminist when writing her music and felt that it was her responsibility to get to know the women of every community as much as she could and equalize society for them. Christian's inspirations for writing music was the inequality of women in society, and her music was her way of fighting for equality and freeing women from their social, political, and economic restrictions. Meg Christian's song Sweet Darlin' Woman became an anthem for the women's music movement because it explores the topics of homosexuality and lesbianism. The song consists musically of Meg Christian's folk-sounding vocals and solo guitar. The lyrics of the song reveal Christian sexuality. For example, Christian sings "I'm still loving you, I can't run from you" to show her love for her significant other or for a woman who she wants to love her back. The title of the song itself and the fact that the song is sung by a woman really speaks to the song's theme and purpose. While on the surface level this seems like a typical love song, Sweet Darlin' Woman is not typical because of the context that it is associated with and the purpose that Meg Christian wrote it for. With lyrics like "Sweet darlin' woman, do you still run away? Please don't take my heart so carelessly, just say the words and I'll be by your side. You know I need your touch, and I will be there though you may disappear." This song could have been written by a man who wanted to sing it to the woman he loved. However, Meg Christian, with a team consisting of only women, wrote the song for the purpose of showing the love between two women. Another member of the women's music movement, Chris Williamson, began as a singer-songwriter of the 1960s. During the 1960s, she wrote many anti-Vietnam War songs as a member of the folk rock movement. However, with the rise of second-wave feminism as a response to the misogyny witnessed in the social and political movements, Williamson quickly moved to writing songs about lesbianism and becoming a member of the women's music movement. She wrote songs that captured the sorrows of women and lesbians who have to hide their sexuality from the rest of their community. Chris Williamson used her inspiration to write Olivia Records' second major hit album, The Changer and the Changed. This album is about finding happiness through honesty and openness, as well as her life and sexuality. The goal of the song, Having Been Touched, was to show women and lesbians that they can be honest about their thoughts and feelings. Having Been Touched is about a woman, the Tender Lady, who Williamson uses as a metaphor for every other woman in the world who is like Williamson. Williamson is speaking to the thousands of women who feel like they had to hide in who they truly are on the inside from the rest of society. Closeted lesbians see and feel the loneliness and lies about their sexuality, for they cannot openly express their love in public. Williamson had very few women to connect with before becoming a part of the women's music movement, and more than likely before second-wave feminism as well. The lyrics "The Tender Lady reads messages like ours" show that there are other women in society who relate to Williamson. And Having Been Touched allows them to see the message that she and others in the women's music movement are trying to spread. Each stanza ends with the lyrics, "Why not give her peace and happiness again?" and closes the song with "Comfort her for me." Each stanza and the entire song, ending the stanzas in the entire song with these lyrics, Williamson asked society to be open to the idea of women and lesbians having the right to express themselves freely. This freedom would allow them to find peace and happiness and comfort in their lives because they do not have to hide who they are from their community. Having Been Touched is not like Meg Christian's love song Sweet Darling Woman. Williamson shows the inner turmoil that women, particularly lesbians, are forced to endure because they do not fit in with the societal norms and do not follow the social mores of the time period, whereas Christian sings a different kind of love song that had never been heard before because it was written about a woman who is in love with another woman. However, both songs allow gay women to express themselves and have shown women that they have the freedom to discuss their feelings. Having Been Touched and Sweet Darling Woman not only have similar goals, but they also have similar musical characteristics and sound. Both songs have thin textures that only consist of vocals and solo instruments for accompaniment, a very similar style to the folk rock music, a subgenre that both Christian and Williamson have experience with. In Having Been Touched, Williamson keeps the texture of the song light with only her vocals and piano, while Christian similarly sings over solo acoustic guitar for accompaniment. Overall, these two songs represent the women's music movement in different ways, but both have the same goals of giving women the chance to discover who they really are and freeing them. In conclusion, the song topics of the women's music movement differed from the topics of songs written by men in rock and roll because of their different inspirations and backgrounds. Their inspirations and the movements that the women's music movement arises out of affect the topics that the artists wrote about. The women of this movement sought a safe space where they could express their love freely without the rules and restrictions of society. Women, especially lesbians, were forced to hide their true feelings in a male-dominated society. Female musicians like Meg Christian and Chris Williamson were able to find that freedom in their music and the topics they used for inspiration, and Olivia Records, a female-founded and female-run company, gave these women the physical space and freedom to explore their topics and write their music. They often used their own experiences as women in social movements of the 1960s and women who had to hide their feelings. Their overall goals seem to be oriented around creating a safe space for women and lesbians to tell their stories and show the patriarchy that the other half of the population is capable of becoming artists. Overall, the goals and topics of the song and the women's music movement differed from the sex and drugs and anti-war topics used in songs written and performed by men in the rock and roll genre. And musically, the songs were gentler and sounded like they came from the folk rock music movement, which it did. Many of the women from the women's music movement started as folk rock musicians, after all. However, their messages differed from the anti-war topics that the folk rock movement typically centered on. The female artists sought freedom from restrictions of social norms and mores. They wanted their stories to be told and heard. Seeing these women of the women's music movement enter the male-dominated world of rock and roll and rise to high levels of success gives hope to young female musicians. Women who have been influenced by the women's music movement include Melissa Etheridge, an out lesbian artist who writes songs that any listener can identify with. In other words, representation matters. When a person, especially a woman, sees another woman in a male-dominated field of work, it gives younger girls inspiration and hope that they can have that same dream and succeed in that same field. Female musicians of the 1990s, such as Melissa Etheridge, Tori Amos, and Alanis Morissette, saw that they could be successful in the music industry because of the women's music movement and artists like Meg Christian and Chris Williamson. The women's music movement took a male-dominated genre and showed women that they can succeed in rock and roll while also writing songs on topic that no one had ever written on before, that being female homosexuality and women's thoughts and feelings.